Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part 3 of my interview with David Eccles Hardy. It's been an epic interview so far. In part 2, we talked about his involvement in the Salt Lake City Olympic bid. We talked about him being a bishop, having his son come out, and we talked as gay, and we talked about his struggles for several years as a bishop to make sense of it all, culminating in David resigning as an LDS bishop and his family kind of exiting the church within a short amount of time. And what it's like to do that in the late 90s before the internet and internet communities. So we kind of left you with a cliffhanger where David Eccles Hardy is becoming a little bit radicalized or militarized as he becomes angrier and angrier about Boyd K. Packer and Spencer W. Kimball and Miracle of Forgiveness and To the One and For Young Men Only or whatever all those pamphlets were, and him thinking about his son and other LGBT people that he came in contact with and all the sexual shame and damage and carnage that was going on in the 90s. We didn't talk about Dean Byrd, by the way, but we did talk about him meeting a lot of LGBT men and seeing the carnage of mixed orientation marriages and celibacy that the church was leaving in its wake with its LGBT policies. So let's start. Did you ever hear the name Dean Byrd? And did that mean anything to you?
No, I did. And my recollection is, and remember, this is like 18 years ago. My recollection is that Dean Byrd had some affiliation with Evergreen.
He started it, or was one of the main, yeah.
So I was,
and not only that, but also, what's the name of the reparative therapy group that? There's some National Association of Reparative Therapy. Narth.
Narth.
That's it. National Association. He was one of the, if not founders, one of the leaders in Narth.
Right.
Which was this sort of quasi pseudo-academic group that was trying to advance reparative therapy through groups like Jonah, Jews offering new attempts at healing, and all the different evangelical groups along with Evergreen that were advancing reparative therapy throughout all the different religious organizations. Yep. That was all Dean Byrd, Evergreen,
yep,
and all that stuff.
So,
yeah.
So to sort of tie that up, that loop up, when I first started serving as bishop, when I first got home with my son from Europe who had just come out to me, there was not a mission companion, but an older missionary in my mission. He was actually an assistant to the president when I arrived in Paris. And I got to know him, I respected him, and he ended up going into doing a lot of counseling work with gay men in the church. And so I took my son up to him for an initial meeting, an initial session, thinking that this would be helpful. And it turned out to be a reparative therapy pitch. And I kind of instinctively knew enough at that point that my son didn't need to be repaired. In fact, it kind of offended me, and it scared the heck out of my son. And he was 13 years old, mind you. And so we left that meeting after it was over, and on the way home, we just told each other that we're not going down that route. That's not what's going on here, and we're not even going to go a step further with that. But I was asked, and I don't remember who asked me, to serve on an advisory board for Evergreen, which I thought, cool. You know, I mean, this is an organization that is trying to advance the thinking on this issue and the dialogue, and I'll do that. Well, I went to 2 meetings, and I was so disappointed in it that I resigned. And when I wrote my letter, I made a reference to being on, I think I said, the board at Evergreen, because I kind of thought it was at the time. I didn't know that if there was some smaller sort of legalistic board of directors or what. This was called the board, but it was an advisory board. And I made reference to that in this letter we're going to talk about. Well, I had comments come back in the press and on the internet that Dean Byrd attacked me for saying I was on the board of Evergreen, that I never had been on the board in Evergreen, and I didn't know what I was talking about. And so that was my interaction with him. He was bitter that I would bring up Evergreen in that, because I did not refer to it in very favorable terms in that letter that I wrote to.
Well, let's get to that. So what turns you from bishop Now we know how you got from bishop to former bishop to kind of ex-Mormon, inactive Mormon, ex-Mormon, non-believing Mormon. Talk us through your path to activist and how that emerged.
So when I resigned as bishop, and the more I thought about what was being said in these pamphlets, in the conference talks, primarily by Boyd Packer, he seemed like the designated attack dog among the apostles. I guess I kind of got fed up. I kind of got angry. And I tried to think about, I didn't have a model of what to do. I just started to think about ways that I could make a public statement that could be heard by the most number of people possible, that could present a different idea on this, and a way to say to the church, to the brethren. I mean, when I say the church, I'm typically saying the apostles and the first presidency. This is not the right discussion. You're actually hurting families. You're actually hurting kids and causing them to attempt suicide or commit suicide. And so the first thing I thought of was writing maybe editorials in the Tribune. And so I wrote an editorial on Easter Sunday in 2000 about this issue that I felt good about writing. There were some interesting comments back to that. I didn't get particularly a lot of hate mail on that, but that was my first attempt to come out and say something publicly. And then there were other events that happened, candlelight vigils for this, when Stuart Mattis.
That's 2000-ish, right?
Yeah. That was, I would be asked to speak at that, and I would speak my mind at that. Well,
at Vigil?
At vigils, at meetings, there was, for example, a symposium that was done by St. John's, I think it was Episcopal Church out in Sandy, that on this issue, and I went and spoke at that. I started to speak places.
You were starting to be a spokesperson for LGBT reform within the Mormon Church.
Yeah, nobody asked me to do that. I mean, but that's what I was doing because I decided that I had to say something.
Someone invited you to speak.
Yeah, but I mean, nobody asked me to be a spokesperson for the LDS.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
By what authority?
By what authority? Yeah. So I started to speak at events more and more. And another example is, it was funny when things happened, like, I don't remember what year it was, but when the Supreme Court case on the Boy Scouts came up, the church filed an amicus brief, which means supporting the Boy Scouts. And, that was news that day. And
supporting the Boy Scouts, that what?
That it was not unconstitutional or illegal for them to prohibit gay scout leaders or the scout leaders that identified themselves as gay. And at the time, my gay son, Judd, who was my oldest of 4 sons, he was an Eagle Scout. My next son down, James, was an Eagle Scout. I had been an Eagle Scout. And the next son down, Skip, was well on his way to being an Eagle Scout. And the day that the church filed the amicus brief, and it was news, I get a knock on my door at home, and it's the camera crew from KSL that wants a contrasting viewpoint. Mm-hmm. So they would kind of come to me.
You became that guy.
I became that guy. And I'll tell you what I found out. It's, you ruffle people one way when you start speaking out against the doctrine and policies and writing of the church. You speak out against Boy Scouts.
That's Thomas S. Monson's baby.
It's a whole different matter. So, yeah, I went on camera that night, and I told them what I thought of it. And that, in fact, earlier that day, I had gone over to the Scout headquarters over by the University of Utah. I didn't have my Eagle badge to turn in anymore, but my son Judd did, my son James did, and Skip had all his merit badges, and we went over and turned them in.
Your whole family was militarized.
Protest. They were, and actually it was fun. I mean, it felt like I was doing something that I felt good about.
You were standing for truth.
I was standing for something that meant something to me, and
against the Lord's truth, of course. But
yeah,
you didn't see it that way.
I didn't see it that way.
You were in a full apostate.
I was in full apostate mode, and
why am I laughing?
Because sometimes you have to laugh. Because with that comes the sense of my entire heritage has been pulled out from under me. I have, I told you about those times I would stand on that rock shelf up on Old Rag Mountain and look west across the Allegheny or the Appalachians to where Utah was in the distance, and I'd feel something here, and that my heritage, didn't feel that anymore. I'd lost it. I felt I'd lost it, and when you do that, you lose your sense of self. I mean, so much of who I was wrapped up in my heritage and my family, where we'd come from, and all the Mormon history and what we'd been a part of, and it was gone overnight for me. And so, anyway, KSL came and did that, and I spoke out against what the Boy Scouts were trying to do and why it was ridiculous that, there were more heterosexual pedophiles. It's the equation of pedophilia with homosexuality that I thought was stupid and ridiculous and wrong.
Because that's your son.
It's my son.
They're calling your son a pedophile.
And I should also say this. That same summer, my son was a junior counselor at Tracy Wigwam, which is a Cub Scout camp at Mill Creek Canyon. And I'd pick him up at the end of the day, and some days he'd be in tears because of what was being said and bantered around about gays. And he'd come home in tears. And so the next week or so after I had done that interview on KSL, I remember I was at a board meeting for a company that I was their counsel for, and I was also on the board. And it was a regional company. It was like an investment bank. And the first half of the meeting went fine, and then there was a break, and then they came back, and the chairman kind of turned to me and he said, "David, you have to stop doing this." And he was referencing speaking out about the Boy Scout issue, the Supreme Court case. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, we do business with the church, and you can't say this anymore. You can't talk about the Boy Scouts like this anymore. And you have to stop it." And I said, this was another one of those points where my anger sort of rose to the surface. And I said, well, I might expect this. I might anticipate this would come from the water district in Richfield or something. But not here, not with a regional company like yours. And it's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with me being on the board. And, the chairman made a comment back that you have to stop doing this. And so I stood up and resigned. That happened twice. But that was over the speaking out on the Boy Scout issue.
Twice.
To two different boards I was on. I was told I had to stop doing what I was doing, that it was wrong. And I resigned.
Do you want to name the board or not? Or
yeah, I don't.
Okay,
actually, it was long enough ago that the name of the companies I don't remember exactly.
That's
They're not around
That's
anymore.
Fine. That's fine.
They're not around anymore. But so we get to the point we're living in the
belly of the beast.
Yeah, in Salt Lake on the east side it was tiring. It was depressing that and so we decided to move up to Park City. A more open kind of an environment, place like that. And so we moved in 2000. We moved up to Park City, and then I did something pretty serious on the issue. At that point in 2000, my son Judd had, I think, just graduated, and he was on his way to NYU to this Tisch School of Arts he got accepted into, and he was a great kid. He was happy. He was doing well. It sort of had worked. Standing up for him and not having him go through what a lot of kids go through, and knowing his parents backed him and would do something serious enough to back him and let him know that. And I remember I run these crazy long mountain races, and I was up training for one up in Uintas just by myself. And I remember being out on a trail there, the Mirror Lake Trail, and saying to myself, now Judd's off to college, so why am I doing this? I mean, what's my goal? And I thought maybe is there anything I can do? Because I'm not going to make the church accept gay marriage. The issue was still there that whether
Hawaii hadn't even happened yet. So gay marriage, was it even on people's mind?
No, but it was on people's mind. I was thinking about it. I mean, I believed in commitment. I believed in being able to evidence that legally if you want to do that, and not having it be denied. But I felt the church wasn't going to do that because I was saying something. And I even felt like I didn't think the church would ever move on its position that this is a choice. This is a lifestyle choice. because that's what the issue was then. And I didn't even think they'd budge on that. So is there anything I could really accomplish? And I thought, yeah, maybe there is. There's those 4 pamphlets, the 2 by Packer, the 1 by Kimball, and for the Strength of Youth, which the Strength of Youth used to say at that time, next to the sin of murder is homosexuality. I mean, having kids read that, imagine that. So I thought...
Did you have a sense that there was suicidality amongst LGBT youth
huge.
at that point?
Yeah. I'd even had experience with it in my own family.
And Stuart Mattis had just happened.
Stuart Mattis had just
that
taken
must
his
have
life.
lit an extra fire for you.
It did.
Tell people about Stuart Mattis who don't
Stuart
know.
Mattis, I don't remember that much about him other than he was, he was in his 20s, I believe, living in Northern California, in the Palo Alto area. And I know he was struggling with this issue, and he...
Returned missionary, super
Returned
devout.
missionary, yep.
I think he was like a tech consultant guy. Like he had a bright future.
But he lost hope. He reached a point where he couldn't see a way that it would get better. And on the steps at the Stake Center, he put a gun to his head.
And he pinned a note to his chest.
Right.
That said, "Do not resuscitate."
Right. So I decided that here's one thing.
And I learned about this at Microsoft when I was at Microsoft, and that was a turning point for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had known others that had committed suicide, and so I decided that there's something that I can do. When I would tell people about what was in to young men only, and I should stop here because I'd already written the letter. I probably should chronologically go over this.
Do it. Yeah.
Leave that there and go back to when I wrote the letter.
Okay.
So I had I practiced solo because I don't like lawyers and I don't like working with them. And so I had a little carriage house on South Temple. Just me. I don't even have a secretary because I do all my own typing and stuff. And so this carriage house had a large atrium. It was large enough to hold a press conference in, which is what came up later when I did this other major thing. But I was thinking at that point in time about doing something that would be meaningful. And I decided that I would write a letter to Boyd K. Packer, who was good friends with my family, my older brother and my oldest sister. My oldest sister was a ghostwriter for Boyd K. Packer. She lived in the Westwood Ward in Los Angeles.
She wrote books.
She wrote books
him?
and articles for him and things like that. And
apostles have ghostwriters? Is that what you're telling me?
Spirit writers.
Spirit writers.
Yeah. And so at her funeral when she died, I was up on the stand with Boyd K. Packer because he was the featured speaker at it. They were that close. And I thought that all right, I need to vent myself and write a letter and tell Boyd K. Packer what his writings are doing, what they're doing to families.
And it wasn't, did you have more than kind of pulling in Sam Young's latest efforts? Was it only LGBT youth you were thinking about, or were you thinking about masturbation, little factories, all that shame as well?
At that point, it was
just
the
LGBT.
Issue.
Okay,
Yeah.
just making sure.
Yeah. And
because that was also a major problem.
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
And so one day at my little carriage house office, I sat down and I just poured myself out on paper and just sort of stream of consciousness writing and wrote a letter that was, about 7 or 8 pages long.
And we're going to put a link to this letter because it ultimately was posted on the internet, and you can get to the story, but it became kind of a well-known thing. Mm-hmm. So, hint to show notes to make sure to include that. But tell us what was in the letter.
Well, I started off just by sort of giving my background in the church, not from the standpoint of name dropping, but from the standpoint of understanding that both my wife and I came from families with rich church heritage. We believed that we had been obeyers, and that, if I said in it, if you know the heart of my sister Claire, who he knew very well, or my brother Ralph, who he knew very well, my older brother, then you know mine. But I said, you have to understand the pain and the damage that your writings are doing on families like mine that have gay children. And then I went through and sort of laid out the issues as I saw them, the primary issues that needed to be addressed that were wrong, which included the sense that you can catch being gay, You can be recruited. They're out recruiting people. It's a lifestyle choice. And worst of all was one of the statements that the reason why my son hasn't been cured is because he's selfish. That I just said in my letter to him, I said, you could not have said something that's more wrong or more offensive to me. And I'm not trying to be offensive back to you. I'm just trying to state to you that this is incredible that you would say something like that. Because my son and the other gay people that I have come to know well are among the most unselfish people I know, and work the hardest to try and figure this out, and have worked the hardest to try and do what is right by themselves and by God spiritually. And so you could not be more insensitive. And then I talked about the issue of Gordon B. Hinckley made some statement that got picked up in the papers in California about, we don't treat our gay members, youth, any different than we do our he didn't use the word straight, but our straight ones. We ask them to not have sex before marriage. Well, how stupid. There is no marriage. You're basically asking my son to be celibate for the rest of his life. And when he said in this comment, they're the same as our single sisters. We ask them to be chaste. And I said, this isn't chastity, this is celibacy. Call it by its real name. Look at the historical, equivalent. Look at the Catholic Church. And the success rate in the Catholic Church of celibacy, which we'll never know, but we know that it probably wasn't stellar. and then imagine that the Catholic priests, they were the general authorities. They were the leaders. They were revered. They were loved and looked up to. And look at their success rate. Now imagine if you were to stand in front of the freshman class at BYU and announce that this entire class was being given a special calling, that they needed to be celibate for the rest of their lives. Imagine the suicides, the depression, the broken lives that would come from that. You have to understand that you use a convenient term of being chaste for the rest of your life when what you're asking for is celibacy and the lack of any emotional intimacy. And I tried to point out how wrong that was. And then the last thing I said in that letter was that, it doesn't make sense what you're doing, because you're basically saying that my son is collateral damage in this eternal struggle for right and wrong, in which, by the luck of the draw, he has no place whatsoever. It's okay that he's collateral damage, because that's just the way it is. And that how wrong it was and how much it was damaging families. So I poured my heart out on this letter, and I held on to it. I didn't send it right then, because I knew that the moment I sent that, even though I had at that point, I didn't believe in the church anymore. I knew that the moment I sent that, it was over. I mean, I would never.
Talk about the request at the end of the letter, because at the end of the letter, you actually try to give some constructive.
I did. I said at the end of the letter that what am I asking for? I said my older brother Ralph asked me once,
who's been a stake president, right?
Washington,
in
D.C.
the D.C. area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you like the church to do? What are you looking for? And I had about 6 things. I said I'd like the church to teach the members and help them understand that they're not going to catch leprosy from my son, and that. And
your son had contemplated suicide, right?
Yeah, he'd had an attempt.
At least
when we were on our journey through this, okay. And so I knew how serious it was,
yeah.
And that they need to really understand that by showing unqualified love and acceptance, their children aren't going to be at risk. They're not going to be at risk. You're going to help real families with real issues get through those. And, that I'd like someone in authority to look at the pamphlets and understand that these were written a long time ago, basically 20 years ago. And I'd like you to understand that it's not helping and to get rid of them. And these are the asks I put in there.
Get rid of the pamphlets.
Yeah. And so, and basically understand that this is an issue. I want somebody in authority to say, you know what? We don't understand this issue very well. And we're going to try and understand it better. And we're going to try and have a better, more productive dialogue on it. Because what we're doing now is divisive and it's damaging. And that was the letter I sent. And I held on to it for several days. Well, you remember Matthew Shepard, the young college student in Laramie, Wyoming. This is when he had been tied to a fence post and pistol whipped to death by 2 young men who had pretended to be gay and picked him up at a bar that knew he was gay, and they took him up to outside Laramie and tied him to a rail fence and pistol whipped him and left him there to die all night long, overlooking the lights of Laramie. And this is right when the trial of those two young men was going. And I had been interested enough in the trial that I had contacted the reporter at the Cheyenne Tribune-Eagle in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and had gotten to know her. And she had said something to me that shocked me. And that is, she said, "Did you know that Russell Henderson, one of the murderers, was Mormon?" And I said, I no, I had no idea. Why don't we know that? And she said, "Yeah, I've talked to his stake president, and I've interviewed the stake president, and he's Mormon." I said, "Wow." So I called, I kind of hesitate to drop names here. I called the religion writer for a prominent Salt Lake newspaper that was friendly. I mean, that because I was doing things and saying things that kind of oftentimes ended up in the religion section. And I told her about this, and she didn't believe me. And I gave her the number of the Cheyenne Tribune-Eagle reporter. Nothing ever came of it. And a lot of people still don't know. Russell Henderson would have been at an age where he would have heard that conference talk by Boyd K. Packer about you must protect yourself. And that pamphlet says you must protect yourself and violence is okay. You must protect yourself. And the trial was on right then. Now, that pamphlet had been gone for a couple of years, hadn't seen it. And that you may remember that the defense in that murder trial was gay panic, a novel defense. But
Which is what?
Gay panic was that he came onto me, I panicked, and I killed him. That's gay. That was this novel defense of gay panic. Well, in reality, we picked him up. We wanted to have some fun with him, and we took him to a fence and pistol whipped him to death. That's not the facts of gay panic, even if that was a valid defense. And it didn't work. They were both convicted. But during that trial, a gay man that I had become good friends with, he called me and he said, "Did you know that at the church distribution center," because his parents were active, "did you know at the church distribution center that To Young Men Only pamphlet is re-released? And not only is it re-released, it's on a display in the middle, right as you walk in, and there's hundreds of them there on display." And I said, "Oh my gosh." I still had my bishop's number. And so I went to the distribution center and got in to be able to buy things. And so sure enough, there it was. And I picked up about 100 copies and bought them and went and reread that you must protect yourself right during the Matthew Shepard trial. And so I went in and licked the stamp, put it on the Boyd K. Packer letter, and dropped it in the mailbox, and felt like, okay, I've burned my boats behind me now. That's it. And
this may have, the letter's dated 1999, so this may have actually been before Stuart Mattis that you wrote the letter.
Yeah. I'm backing up a little bit.
No. I'm just, it was pre-Stuart Mattis.
Yeah, it was pre-Stuart Mattis.
Yeah.
And so I waited to see if a response
Which is cool.
would come.
You know what I mean? It's just like, you're a prophet, man.
You're
a pioneer.
Every day I looked at my son and I just saw the injustice and that this was just wrong. And it wasn't like there was a whole group of members who were allies. There were no allies.
Did you try and reach out to Carolyn Pearson during this time?
I got to know Carolyn Pearson.
She wrote Goodbye, I Love You. Was she helpful? Was she a mentor?
Wonderful. She was wonderful. In fact, one of her later books that includes stories of families and people like that, one of the chapters is about our family. Well, it wasn't No More Goodbyes. It was another one after that was, I can't remember the...
Goodbye, no. Okay. Anyway.
But it was a collection of vignettes about families.
And
that
your
were
family
dealing
was
with this.
featured in there? Oh, cool.
And she was wonderful. But there were no allies. There weren't, And so I sent the letter off and awaited a response if I was going to get one. And that's when, about a week later, I got a call from Marlon Jensen.
Again, this is the second talk with Marlon Jensen, right?
This is the...
Because you had mentioned one before, right?
Well, I had talked with you off camera about the response from Boyd K. Packer through him, I think.
Okay.
So I think this was the first one, and then I met with him separately the second time. I can't remember which came first.
That's fine.
But anyway, he called me and he said, "David, I've been tasked by Boyd K. Packer to respond to your letter." And this is when he was in the first quorum of the 70, Marlon Jensen. And he said, it was interesting because he said, "This is not me talking. This is Boyd K. Packer, and I'm going to put on my Boyd Packer hat." It's okay. And I was at that time, because I like to pace when I talk on the phone, I walked around the block, South Temple, around where my office was, and I was talking with Marlon Jensen. He asked me to tell you 3 things. And I'm going to paraphrase and shorten him down, but he says he wants me to tell you 3 things. First is he's right and you're wrong. The second is that he's used to people doing things like this, and he is going to tell you that you will come back and ask for his forgiveness. And the third thing is that he considers this letter to be highly confidential, and you may not show it to another person. And if, heaven's sake, if it gets on the internet, you'll be excommunicated. And so I hung up from that phone call and walked into my office and pressed the button and posted it to Affirmation. And
Their website.
Yeah. And it got picked up by other websites after that. But, over the course of the next decade, I probably had 400 or 500 responses, either emails or people that found my phone number, or even came by the office at times, my office, that were really heartwarming to me, that said it had made a difference in people's lives and in families. And I also got about 100 hate mails to my office, and they were always unsigned. I thought that was interesting. The hate mail was always unsigned. A couple of them had to be from people in my resident ward that I had been in, because of things that they said. But that for me was kind of like crossing the Rubicon, and there was no going back on that. And then to pick back up that story about when I was trying to figure out what could I do now that my son was out of the nest and his life was good and it was going forward. Why am I doing this anymore? Why am I kicking against the pricks constantly? Trying to figure out what else I can do to raise the awareness.
No pun intended.
Yeah, pun intended, I guess. And it was interesting too, because every time that I would get ready to publish something, an op-ed, or I was going to be interviewed, anytime I knew that I was going to say something publicly, I would send a letter to Gordon B. Hinckley, addressed to him saying, I'm going to do this. This is what I'm going to say. And the reason why I did that is because he and my father were best friends on their mission. And when my dad died, he was very, very good to my mom and close to her. There was a very tight bond there. And so I just thought, I'm going to be up front and tell him what I'm going to do. I never heard a response, never got anything. But in October of 2000, after I went on that run up in Uintas, and I thought, what can I do? And I know what I'll do. I'll expose to the light of day, sunlight, what these pamphlets say, because members wouldn't believe me. When I'd say that this one says you must protect yourself and it's okay to beat up your companion to protect yourself, they would say, no, you must be misconstruing what he said. No one would say that. And if you weren't LGBT, a kid, or if you weren't a parent of one, or if you weren't a bishop or a stake president, you'd never see these pamphlets typically. You wouldn't come across them. And members would say, no, you're wrong. You don't know what they say. So I thought, okay, I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to hold a press conference the day before October 2000 conference starts. And I'm going to have all the pamphlets here, and I'm going to underline them all, and I'm going to expose them in the light of day and say, this is what they say. Now, church, own it, so that everybody knows this is what you say, or get rid of them. And I didn't know how to do a press conference, and I had a cousin who was the head of the Hinckley Institute of Politics, more like an uncle, up at the U, J.D. Williams. And I went up to him and said, how do we do a press conference? He says, well, you do a press statement, and you make a little kit, and you put copies of the pamphlets in it, and you underline them in yellow, and send it off to whoever you want to send it off to. So I sent it off to every media outlet, print, radio, television, magazines, from like Logan to Provo, and scheduled it at my little carriage house office for Friday before General Conference started in October 2000. And the day arrived, and I expected maybe 10 to show up, and I was pretty scared. I mean, I didn't know who the ex-bishop that had done something like this before, and about 50 or 60 showed up. I mean, it was packed. And so, and the other thing is that I had been part of a group that I used to consider sort of heretical, that's called Family Fellowship, of both parents that are in the church and ex-Mormons that support their gay children.
That was Bill Bradshaw.
Yes. And Bill Bradshaw and Gary and Millie Watts. I had asked them all to come and stand with me at this when I gave this press conference, just for moral support, if nothing else. And Bill Bradshaw, I think it was Bill Bradshaw, but Gary and Millie Watts, who I'd become very close with, they showed up, and nobody else did. And so I gave my statement, and it was like it was on the news. It's funny, Gary Watts just gave me clips of all the news articles that ran that night, all the news stories, on KSL and Fox and everything like that. And it's kind of funny to see me that long ago. I had white hair then too. And but after that was over, they asked questions, and then the whole group of them went down to the church office building and asked to speak to Gordon B. Hinckley. And he sent the church spokesman out, who gave the statement that became the mantra that was always given when I'd publish something or be interviewed on something, or a newspaper or a magazine article would come out, and they'd ask the church for comment. And the statement was, words to this effect: we love these children, we love these people, we want them to be a part of us. That was it. And so that was, pretty controversial news that day, the day before General Conference. And after General Conference was over, my brother, who's about 12 years older than me, came over to my office and came in and sat down on my office couch. And he just said, "David, you have to stop doing this. You're embarrassing the church. You're embarrassing Elder Packer, and you're embarrassing the family, and you need to stop doing this." And I said, "Ralph, this is not something I'm going to stop doing." And more words. And then he said the one thing that again took me to that point where I went over the edge a bit. And I told you how close I felt to my father, even though he'd been dead so long. And Ralph said to me, he said, "David, our father is weeping on the other side." And that just hit me hard. And I sort of pulled him up out of the couch and escorted him over the door and pushed him out my door. And I didn't talk to him for years and years.
Why?
After that.
Why were you so mad?
Because he had brought my father into it to shame me. And I didn't feel like that was worthy of shame, and it made me angry. And so...
Was he right? Would your dad have been ashamed?
No.
No?
No.
Why not?
Because I believed that I knew my dad, what he would have been like. And I didn't feel like what I was doing was wrong. If there was an afterlife. I mean, I didn't know at that point what I believed. I didn't believe the doctrine of the church anymore. And I was sort of on a journey from, atheism to agnosticism to I believe in something, I just don't have the answers. I have all the questions now, not the answers, which was fine. But that was the most hurtful thing that happened to me in the entire journey. And so it was after that we moved up to Park City, and my marriage sort of imploded, not because of this issue, but because we'd left the church. My wife and I ended up with sort of different values about what sort of general principles were. Monogamy was a big one for me, and she was like kind of a kid in a candy shop with no rules now. And
that happens.
It led to something that just was like getting hit in my face with a baseball bat, and it just all went to hell. And so that is sort of my journey up to that point, and I went for the next several years not speaking out as much. I should tell you that also at that point in time when we moved to Park City, some pretty prominent articles came out that made us even more controversial. The Nation magazine, Katie Rossman, who was a writer for The Nation and for the New Yorker, came out, and David France, the photographer for Newsweek, came out, and they did an article called "Mormon Family Values" about our family and our decision that appeared in The Nation, and that caused a stir here. And then Newsweek did an article on the Boy Scout issue and gays, and featured my son in it and our family. And so...
Around what years again?
The Newsweek article had come out earlier. It had come out during that time when the Supreme Court case was going. The Nation article, which was a much longer, if you Google my full name, that's the second thing. The letter comes up first, and then the Nation article called "Mormon Family Values" come up. And it was a well-written article. It really followed the journey well. And that came out in 2000, I believe. And so it was like it was my extended family I was estranged from. My nuclear family, my children and my wife, I felt, we were together, and that was fine. I had had a lot of other people become estranged from me, clients, friends. I was a heretic, and there wasn't a lot of support, and there weren't members that were supportive. There weren't allies. They just didn't exist, seemingly.
LGBT allies.
Right. There was nobody there. And so, I had people
No
that
Mama
were...
Dragons,
No, wasn't around.
Mormons building bridges.
No, wasn't around.
Right.
And I had people that I respected very much. I was kind of young when I was called as a bishop, so some of the other church leaders I served with were prominent people in town here, and I had become good friends with them, and I had them come over to... and sort of seek me out and meet with me or ask me to meet with them to try and call me back into the flock, to try and call me to repentance. And I'd had words with them. And, I remember meeting with one who had been a good friend. Our daughters, his youngest and my oldest, lined up. And we had, been on many trips to Lake Powell with them and was close friends with him. And he, made the point to me, meeting with him in his office. He was the head of a major corporation here. He just said, David, you're being asked to be Abraham, and Judd is Isaac. That hit me wrong, and I just stood up and I said to him, well, great, tell me where the angel is to stay my hand. And I left, and that was the last time I talked to him for years and years until I moved back to Utah after I left. So I pretty much felt estranged from just about every friend and lots of my clients and pretty much everyone that I'd been close to before in Utah, except for my nuclear family. And then when this happened after moving to Park City and my marriage blew up, it was kind of like knocking the second leg out from under me. And I went into a pretty dark period for a while. It was...
Yeah, one of the really insidious things about the way the church operates, and cults sort of have this in common with the church, is there's no respectful way to leave the church. And as Thomas McConkie once told me, a cult is any organization that won't let you leave with your dignity intact. And so all believing Mormons are seeded with this idea that if you leave the church, you become an adulterer and you lose your family and you get divorced and you become a drunk and a drug addict and all that stuff, right?
And the reason why that happens is because you've turned against the church. That's your just desserts from it.
And so this is, I relate to a lot of this. My marriage is doing great now, but there were some sketchy times. And there's some things that I've avoided because I've been able to learn from the lessons of others, but I can certainly relate to this idea that it's really traumatic on the family to go through this. It's hard to go through a faith crisis. Faith crisis can destroy a marriage or a family, and it can tank an individual. But when you add on top of that, feeling like you live in a state where your entire community and family have all now turned on you and either cut themselves off from you or you from them, or become enemies or hostile towards you, you wonder about the whisper campaigns. You feel unsafe as a heretic in a sea of orthodox believers. And your life can start to fall apart, right?
Right.
And then the weird tragedy of it all is you become, of course your life falls apart, and then you become the cautionary tale. It's like, look what happened to David Eccles Hardy.
Correct.
He stood against the pricks. He fought against the Lord. He violated his temple covenants. He spoke ill of the Lord's anointed, and he got his just desserts.
And at family reunions...
Did you think about that at the time?
Absolutely.
What's that like?
It was painful. It made me feel more isolated and more alone. And, I was kind of, in a lot of ways, the glue in my family. I have a little different personality from my siblings, and I had started getting our extended family together for family reunions, and we put on some great family reunions. And after I left the church, those carried on for a couple of years after that. But I even heard that one of my in-laws had gotten all the grandchildren together. At that point, there were about 25. So not my children, but my siblings' children, and had spent an evening giving them using me as a cautionary tale. Look, this is what happens. when you deny the church and you leave it. And so up until 2011, I was involved, maybe not as much as I was during those years that I was very militant. And I should tell you, by the way, that after that press conference where I asked the church to admit the language and own the language in the pamphlets or get rid of them, the church spokesman said that, no, we'll not get rid of them. And then over the period of about the next 6 months, they quietly disappeared. And so, I thought that the king is dead, long live the king. They never admitted why they were doing something. They just sort of quietly did it when they did anything, and didn't admit they were wrong in doing it in the first place.
Yeah, and that's, whether it's ordained women or Sam Young or, people who fought for LGBT rights or the people that spoke out about church history in the essays, the church never sort of like says, wow, you guys have fought for something good. Thank you so much. We're going to make these changes. Thank you for being a part of helping us do what's right. Best case, they make the change and give no credit.
Correct.
Worst case, they go after and punish and excommunicate the people that were the very reason the change happened.
Correct.
What happened with you?
Well, so I got to a point in 2011 that I was done with Utah. I was done with everything Mormon.
But you weren't excommunicated.
Well, in 2011, when I hit that point, I sent 2 letters, one about 6 months apart, and had requested to have my name taken out. This is before there was any kind of streamlined system. So I found out where I should send a letter. I send a letter asking for my name to be removed. I never heard anything back, ever. And then I sent another one 6 months later, never heard anything back. And I checked and I was still on the rolls. So what I did is found out who my stake president was in Park City. I'd never been to church, but I found out who he was, and I took a collection of all the op-eds I'd written, of videotapes or CDs or DVDs, and sort of, this is everything I've said and what I've done. And as I look back at the excommunications that had happened before me, I couldn't understand why, especially after holding that press conference, why I had not been excommunicated. And so I took everything visual, tangible that I had done, and I took it over to my stake president's house and knocked on the door, and they got him. He came to the door, and I said, "Hi, you don't know me. I'm David Hardy." He says, "Oh, I know who you are." And I said, "Okay, well, I'm a former bishop. I guess maybe I am once a bishop, always a bishop. And here is evidence of everything that I've done." And I said that I know enough to know that if you don't call me into a disciplinary council, you have no integrity. And I never heard anything, ever. And I just had a similar experience like 2 months ago. I'll finish it off with.
How do you explain that?
I don't know. Well, the one thing I said to myself was that my mother was such close friends with Gordon B. Hinckley that he didn't want to hurt her by excommunicating me. I mean, I don't have no idea.
She wasn't alive, though, was she?
At that point, she was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she was. And so I don't know what to make of it. I don't know. Well, the other thing is that this Katie Rossman, who wrote the article for The Nation magazine, she had made it known that if I was excommunicated, that she'd be out here to do a big article on it. And I don't know, maybe it was an issue the church at that time just didn't want any more press on. I don't know. But I never was excommunicated. I never had my name taken off the rolls because they wouldn't. And so in 2011, I turned my back on everything.
Okay.
I moved east.
Before we talk about that, something I don't understand. 2 things. Number one is, so it sounds like that press conference and the letter and all that stuff happened very early 2000s.
Yeah. Well, no, the press conference was in October 2000.
Right.
Oh, you mean 2000?
Early 2000, yes. Yeah. So, but there's still another 11, 12 years in Utah.
Yeah. I was trying to deal with it and adjust to it.
So you just kind of stayed in the nest that you had pooped in, so to speak.
Right. I kept my law practice going, and I learned to live in it, but I always felt like I was at the center of a vortex. I was a lightning rod, and people felt I was a heretic and told me to my face that I was.
Was there a point that you stopped the activism, or did you keep being an activist during that whole time?
I kept being an activist. I tended to write op-eds and things like that. The opportunities to speak, it seemed like there was a lull for a period of time, and I don't know if that was just me or if there really was a lull. I don't know, but it wasn't as active as it had been. And plus, I was up kind of isolating, if you will, in Park City to a certain extent. I wasn't dealing with the people in Salt Lake and Ogden, where my family was, and where the friends that I'd once had were.
Okay, my other question is just personal curiosity. So Mormon Stories starts in 2005. So that's 6 years Mormon Stories was chugging along, 12 years, 7 years where you hadn't heard of it. How is it that you were a prominent ex-Mormon and you had never heard of Mormon Stories? That's not to question that you hadn't heard about it. How does that happen?
Because I didn't for that period of time.
Were you just cut off?
I was cut off. I cut myself off, but I was still coming down to Salt Lake every day to practice law, but I wasn't interacting with anybody in Salt Lake. And I had turned away so much from the Mormon community. That included, I didn't even know there was an ex-Mormon community getting started. I had no idea.
You were isolated.
I was isolated.
Yeah.
And I felt it.
That must have been super lonely.
It
That's
was.
really my point. Is that
It was.
You had to have been in a box to have not heard about anything
I was.
that was going on between 2004 and 2011.
I just didn't want to feel anymore.
So what was that like for your mental health?
Well, it probably wasn't good. I started to drink. I went through a period that
Another
I drank.
Cautionary tale,
Another
right?
cautionary tale.
Fulfilling.
I at one point, I used to tell people that I went from 0 to 100 on alcohol probably faster than anyone. And after about a year, put myself in rehab for a month, and it was a kind of a dark, lonely time. It was, and I did other things that gave me, a sense of enjoying. I like to run in the mountains. I used to run this crazy 100-mile mountain race, and I concentrated on that, and I tried to concentrate on building my business practice again, with having lost a lot of my clients that were Mormon, and so I just kept myself busy doing that. But from a standpoint of how I was feeling emotionally, and that it was lonely. It was not a good time at all. It was bad.
And as you were living those 10 years still in Utah as an apostate and as a pariah, and your family had dissolved, how did you contemplate, like, reflecting on what you had done in terms of, like, man, I shouldn't have done this, or man, I wish I had it to do over again, or man, was it really worth this dead end catastrophe to stand up for these things that nobody really seems to care about? The church just kind of yawns and moves on, and the members kind of hiccup and then forget that you ever existed, I'm guessing, in some ways. Mm-hmm. What was that like? Did you ever have moments of deep regret?
I didn't. I never had one.
Now, how's that?
It was good. That's probably what gave me more strength inside and allowed me to continue to feel great about myself in that respect. And that is that I felt like I'd done something that was true to me, and that I said things that had needed to be said, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
That's kind of cool.
Well, it gave me a sense that my life hadn't been lived in vain at that point, because things seemed pretty dark, but I felt like, if anything, I'm glad for what I did, and I feel good about it, and I would do it again if the same situation arose.
So what made you decide to leave Utah?
I was tired of feeling like I was the apostate in the center of a polarized place, that I happened to be a polarizing element. And I still heard enough of issues, of people talking about me and things that they would say, that I didn't need to be here anymore. I mean, I had other attorneys say things in open court referencing me that were pretty nasty, and that are on the court record. And I just said, why would I want to stay here anymore in this culture that is this nasty? Toxic. And so I just pulled up stakes and I moved east. I spent a year in Katy, Texas, working in
Katy Tigers,
working in Houston. And then I decided to do a startup company and not be a lawyer for a while, and do a startup company in Boston. And I did that for 18 months. And then I had a college roommate that had been like my best friend, but we'd fallen out of touch over the years. He contacted me, and he had ended up in Woodstock, Vermont, 2.5 hours north of Boston. He found out I was in Boston, and he said, I'm tired of being retired, and I want to do an internet startup, and will you join me and found this with me? And so I said, sure. Moved up to Woodstock, Vermont, and I was there for almost 4 years.
And
I had nothing to do. I didn't even think about the church. John, I didn't even hear about your journey. One thing I did hear about, because it was in the news that it was probably on Sirius Radio on CNN or something, was the policy that came out in November.
Well, you didn't hear about Kate Kelly's excommunication or mine. Yeah.
I didn't.
Okay. But the 2015 policy.
I did. But here's the funny thing is, I turned and didn't want to have anything to do with the church anymore. And yet, where did I end up? I end up in a place in Vermont that the place that we went shopping, I went shopping for my groceries, and the gas station I filled my car up at in West Lebanon, New Hampshire, I found on the internet, because I like history, there was a picture of the little white frame house where the gas station sits now, which is where Joseph Smith was as a 6-year-old boy and got that operation on his leg.
In a gas station, that's cool.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, no, but there I was. There I was 10 miles from Sharon, Vermont, and it was like, okay, I've jumped from the frying pan into the fire, and I thought that was ironic that I ended up right in sort of ground zero of early Mormon history. But after getting that startup ready to launch in Vermont and deciding that I had children here. And 5 of my 6 children were here, and 2 were married, and I had grandchildren that I hadn't seen for a long, long time, and it was kind of time to move back and reactivate my law license, and I didn't know how long I would stay. I didn't expect to find what I found.
So yeah, this almost has a prodigal son feeling to it. Like, did your mental health and happiness increase after leaving Utah, or decline, or plateau, or up and down?
It was up and down, and part of it was due. I got into a second marriage that I shouldn't have gotten into too fast, and that was challenging.
Okay.
So there was a lot of great times. I enjoyed what I was doing in Vermont with my partner, and I enjoyed what I did in Boston in doing that startup, but it wasn't an easy time, and so I come back to Utah and end up ending that second marriage, and then, like, from the day that happened, it was like everything turned up quick in my life. Because,
are you saying there's a happy ending to the story?
Oh, there's a very happy ending.
Tell us. We're ready for it.
Well, I will tell you this, and I'd like people to understand this, because this is one thing I found out is true, and that's that for all those years, I hated the church. I hated my first wife, and I carried it right here. And that's like a toxic tar that keeps you in a place of on and off pain and feeling like a victim and waiting for the other shoe to drop. And there's always another shoe. And, if you're waiting for it to drop, of course it drops. And yet, for some reason, when I ended that second very difficult marriage, it was like a plug pulled in the back of me and everything drained out. I wasn't asking for it. I wasn't looking for it. It just happened. And all of a sudden, I didn't hate the church. I didn't hate my first wife. All that hatred that I had in it just drained out. And what that opened up was, honestly, waking up happy, seeing that in every day, that honestly, it sounds like a cliche, but it was like there were little miracles that happened every day and kept happening. And it even got to the point where I wondered, okay, so I'm just on a roll here. And what happens when something really bad happens? Again.
But the trigger was the divorce?
For some reason, that's kind of what triggered. Maybe
that was your low?
That was a break with the past. That was sort of finally moving beyond everything. But it sort of was a catharsis in everything. All the bad, toxic feelings in me just subsided and just left.
It was a good divorce.
Well, it was a good thing to do. And it just opened up a long period that keeps going of feeling very good and good things happening, because I find that...
What were the good things that started happening?
Well, I don't know.
Take us through how things got better.
I restarted my law practice. It went well.
You moved here?
I moved here.
Okay.
I moved here. And then I had read about someone named Stephanie Larson in HuffPost in a thing called Encircle. when I was in Vermont. And I was on my way down to see a movie one night in September, which bachelors tend to do a lot that are bored. And I had read on Facebook, which I was kind of a new member on, trying to establish myself again and create a network. I'd read there was a back-to-school event at this Encircle in Provo. And I decided to not go to the movie and continue driving south and go down to that. And I did, and I met Stephanie, and I saw the house. And I experienced what the house felt like. And it was so good. It was so positive that I went up and introduced myself to Stephanie. I said, Stephanie, you don't know me. My name's David Hardy, and I've been really controversial in the past, but I would love to be involved. And she said, oh, you're not too controversial. You know, I'd love to have you. And we talked. We started talking that night, and we talked about that this needed to expand to Salt Lake and other places, and outside of Utah, outside of the Mormon sphere of influence, because this issue of suicide among youth exists in other conservative religious cultures as well as it does in Mormon cultures. And I said to her, you know, I have been involved in a lot of companies and big deals and things like that as a lawyer, not as a fundraiser. And I don't know how to fundraise. But you know what? I'm going to do it. And let's go out and find a house in Salt Lake, and let's go out and find another house. Hasn't been announced yet, but we did. And I said, Stephanie, let's put it under contract. And I don't know how to do it, but I'll figure out how to do it. And so when
you made that emotional connection with Encircle, what was that connection about for you? What was going through your mind, through your heart?
Making a difference for kids that were depressed and committing suicide. And families.
And what about your history channeled that? Or
what about my
was it
wife?
everything you had? Was it your son? Was it everything you
had done? It was everything, but it was allowing me to become involved in a cause that meant it was dear to me, and do it in a way that I could do it and not feel like I was sticking a poker up somebody's butt, you know, and being a nasty guy and being a heretic and a gadfly and speaking out.
All right, so I'm calling a timeout and do one of my sort of coach moments here. I do this in other episodes sometimes, but liberal, progressive, and post-Mormons. So many of you are feeling lost and struggling with your sense of meaning, your sense of purpose, with your sense of existential angst, your morality, your identity, your family, your society, your community, your spirituality. And you come to coaches like me or like my wife or therapists like Natasha Alford Parker or others, and you're seeking help. You're depressed, you're struggling, you're sad. You sometimes are hopeless. And I have to highlight that what we are talking about right here for many of you is going to be a major key and a source for healing and well-being. It's exactly what I did after I went through my faith crisis back in 2000, 2001. Not everyone's going to be able to be an activist. Not everybody's going to be able to be a Stephanie Larson or a Jeremy Runnels or a, pick your activist or pick your kind of person who has tried to build something and make a big difference. But what I can testify to you as a coach, as a PhD in psychology, as someone who has dedicated his life to trying to help people find joy, healing, and happiness after Mormon orthodoxy, is that if you can find a cause, find something to give your life to, something that provides you meaning and purpose, it can cure depression. It can cure anxiety. It can heal the wounds of the past and allow you to make meaning out of your crisis, out of all the collateral damage that comes from your life. It allows you to turn that into something purposeful, which is to alleviate suffering for others who are still facing challenges from what you have emerged from. And so I want to make a call to anyone who's paying attention to follow David Eccles Hardy's example and find that cause, whatever it is. You may not know at first. You may just start stumbling through the darkness with one step of light at a time for years, not knowing where it's going to lead. When I left Microsoft, podcast didn't exist yet. So I left Microsoft in 2004. not knowing what I'd be doing, only knowing that I had to do something. Leave Microsoft, 2004, learn about podcasts, 2005, start Mormon Stories. And I can tell you that I gave up a couple $100,000 a year, multi-million-dollar career, 14 years later, in spite of all the pain and the sadness and the suffering that we've experienced as a family, I've never regretted once leaving one of the top 5 companies in the world and leaving a big 6-figure salary. And it's because I'm able to do this, which is to spend my life providing you with stories that help you find meaning and purpose and joy and healing in your life. And so I'm just going to have to highlight that moment and thank you for being such a shining example of what I hope my listeners will do as well. Those who feel called to do it. So back to your story.
And let me just say the other thing that I came to realize that I think was probably the most important thing I came to understand through all of this. Not that I always did it easily or did it well. Not that I don't have to remind myself of it still, but it's that the greatest pain for me came when I all of a sudden found myself shot down another tributary that I didn't intend to go down, that was carrying me somewhere. And I wanted to be back here. That's where I thought I was supposed to be, was on this tributary, was on this river. And all of a sudden, boom, I was on this river. And what did I do? I swam with all I had to get back up to this one and get to where I had thought I was supposed to be and go down. And that's painful. That was a cause of conflict and pain in my life until I figured out that maybe there really is, whether you call it God or the universe or whatever, I believe there is some kind of a benevolent power that seeks for order rather than chaos and seeks for our good, our well-being. And you have to trust that when you're pushed down that tributary that's dark and you have no idea where it's going, let it take you there. Don't fight it. And you'd be surprised where it takes you. And I think that was the most important lesson I learned. And so I went down to Encircle because I felt myself going down another tributary. And Stephanie and I decided that night that we would do this. We would expand it. I'm sure she'd already thought about that before, but I presented an opportunity to her that I said, I won't say I was lying to her. I really believed I could. I didn't know how I would do it, how I would raise the money. And so Stephanie found a house and we looked at it, and she put, they put an option on it for 60 days in another house in another city. And I put out on Facebook a post that said, I've decided I'm going to raise large donations for Encircle, and we're going to expand it. And I talked about Encircle. And one thing I said that meant the most to me was that Stephanie told me that at that point in time, Encircle had only been going about 11 months, I think. And she said that, in that 11 months of about nearly 1,000 youth that had been through some level of programs at Encircle, even if it was just to come over after school and hang and do their homework, or go through the focus groups, or go through the counseling, or parents going through the counseling. But of that entire group of kids, 1,000, not one suicide. That shocked me. I mean, the governor's got a task force because the Utah suicide rate is at the top of the nation. And yet, what can it really accomplish? It's not really accomplishing tangible results at this point. Encircle, on the other hand, 1,000 kids in that less than a year period of time and not one suicide, that was meaningful to me. And now it still goes on. It's over 2,000. And I know it may not always be the case. There could happen a suicide, but the fact that it hasn't shows it works. And the approach of Encircle works. This is not about politics. This is not about religion. This is just about loving. It's triage. It's triage and this battlefield for these kids that are thrown into waters they don't know. And parents, that if there had been an Encircle to have me as an LDS parent and a spouse, have me and my wife go to, who knows what the trajectory would have been. I don't know. I mean, maybe it probably happened the way it was supposed to happen, but you don't know. And the fact of the matter is the resource wasn't available. Now it is, and it has tangible results. So I put this post out on Facebook, and I had a few people following me from my high school Sidwell friends in DC that I hadn't been in touch with for 40 years. And there was this one person on there whose name I didn't recognize. It was named Brad Clark. and I didn't recognize him from my class, and I didn't recognize his face. And the next morning at 6:30 in the morning, I get a message on Messenger from Brad Clark, and he said that, David, I've been thinking, wondering what I could do to make a difference in the world, and I've just sort of come into my full family inheritance, and I think I'd like to do this. And so we messaged back and forth, and the long and the short of it is that Brad Clark stepped up immediately, before he even came out here.
A non-Mormon.
A non-Mormon, not gay, no gay kids, just had seen my post and remembered me, and he stepped up and donated more than $1 million and gave us enough to close on the house in Salt Lake, close on another house. And it moved me in such a way that none of these people in my earlier Washington, D.C. life, which was a good life, but none of them knew the journey I had been on. And it's like there was a whole middle portion of my life that was hard, and that had been struggles and had been difficulty. And nobody knew what I had gone through. And now all of a sudden to have Brad Clark, whose name, by the way, when I went to school with him, was Buddy. He said, "Oh, you don't know me as Brad, you know me as Buddy Clark." "Oh, Buddy Clark, of course." And even then, for 7 years together in the same small class at Sidwell Friends, we didn't talk more than maybe 3 or 4 times. I mean, there was no reason for him to reach out and do this, but he did it. And it was like a circle closed for me. And it was really sweet. And then he came out, and now we've become best friends. And I kicked myself saying, what kind of an idiot kid was I, a teenager, that I didn't recognize who this person was. And so I keep on now, raising large donations. And you know what? It's easy. It's fun. It's a cause that I believe in. So I do that as well. And that means a great deal to me.
So what has it been like to see the movie Believer come out and to see Love Loud 1 and 2 happen? What's that been like?
Well, I was still off the grid enough that when Love Loud 1 happened, I didn't know about it. I had no idea it was going on because I had no idea about Encircle. But to be a part of it, a minor part of it this time, and to experience it, and to see someone like Dan Reynolds come out, who's straight and who's struggled, gone through the same faith crises, and to see him devote so much and so passionately to this cause, it's amazing. It's wonderful to go attend Love Loud this last time and stand there. I went down and stood near the stage, and when the lights went off on people's wrists, and you saw that entire stadium just filled with those lights, I reflected back on what it was like 18, 20 years ago and said, I never expected this to happen. I never expected to find you here. I never expected to find an entire community of not just ex-Mormons, but Mormons, members whose hearts have changed. Many of the people that I had had the harshest discussions with, that I felt the worst about, having turned on me, if you will, and considered me a heretic, I've had time and time again them be at lunch with them or reconnect with them, and them saying, they said, "David, I'm sorry about what happened earlier. Maybe you were just a little ahead of the curve on this one." And to see that change in people's hearts, and not that the church has changed, not that the policy has changed, but I think that people have been given enough leeway, whether it's because the church wants to appear like it's sort of a kinder, gentler organization on this issue and not be hammered on it as much until the policy got leaked. But the members have been given, I think, greater freedom to use their hearts and to all of a sudden look at their gay children or gay grandchildren or brothers or sisters or people they know in a different way than they ever were allowed to do so before, and they're allowed to think for themselves on this issue. And there's a whole community, I found, of active practicing Mormons who are fierce allies, and ex-Mormons a whole community that are fierce allies, and that I never expected to find this. It was an amazing thing to me.
Yeah, I just can't imagine what it would be like to kind of leave Utah with your tail between your legs, your life eviscerated almost for standing up for a cause, feeling totally alone, feeling totally marginalized and rejected, and then to come back 5 years later and to see something like Love Loud and Encircle and Mormons Building Bridges and Mama Dragons and, just all the different groups and support groups and organizations, even a Rebirth of Affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
What's that like to have sort of been a pioneer before it was kind of cool, and then to come back and see all this now?
It fills my heart. It really, just standing in that stadium and seeing all those lights. Who would have imagined? I wouldn't have imagined.
How many thousand Utahns? 30,000? What?
30,000 or so.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing. And then I meet them every day, members.
And people apologize to you for judging you.
Yes.
and how they treated you.
Yes, not everybody, but
what's that like?
Most people. It's joy, great happiness.
Is it rude to say you feel vindicated? Would you ever want to admit that? Because it kind of looks like you're on the right side of history.
I'm sure it makes me feel vindicated. But I always felt the whole time like I am so glad what I did. I don't know that vindication even entered into it. I'm just so amazed and happy to see the change in the spirit of people here, not organizations, but people. Mm-hmm. That it sort of gives me a rebirth of belief in humanity.
So I'm told you have a story about Prop 8 and child abuse that I should ask you to tell, but I'm going to couple that pedophilia and I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but
I think I do.
Okay, and then I want to pair that with a question about the LDS Church, and I know Encircle. I'll just have to say shout out to Stephanie Larson. I've seen a lot of cool Mormon initiatives in the past 14 years. Lots of podcasts, lots of websites, lots of blogs. Lots of nonprofits come and go. I've never seen anything like Encircle. The level of professionalism and just achievement in such a short amount of time at a national level is just earth-shattering. And I could never have envisioned a Stephanie Larson or a Jacob Dunford or any of the good staff at Encircle. It's more than a miracle. It's mind-blowing.
Nor how people view it as the most positive organization.
Yeah.
I mean, it has
that's
such
part of it.
cred.
Well, that's part of it. With Steve and Barb Young, out at front, with Tom Christofferson having supported it for quite some time, and with all the people that support it now, and freaking the governor declaring last Saturday or whatever it was, Love Loud Day.
Yeah.
The state of Utah declaring Love Loud Day. Forget the LDS Church's second endorsement. It got the first endorsement, which is huge. But now we've got the governor of Utah and the state of Utah declaring Love Loud Day.
Yeah.
And that all goes back to Encircle and Stephanie Larson and her team, her board, the good people on her board, the good people that work for her, and all the people who have donated and supported her. Freaking Encircle is a miracle.
And
a real miracle.
It is a complete miracle. And the approach that has allowed it to be this way, the brilliance in approaching this as something that is a-religious, non-religious at all, and that is only about letting these kids know that they will thrive, they can thrive, and letting them know that when they come to that beautiful house in Provo, and when they come to this house, it will be a gem in Salt Lake, a historic house. And another city that they'll find out about.
I know what city.
You know what city they're talking about. But not stopping there, we have Lubbock, Texas. That's not a Mormon city. We're working with, and that other cities all over the conservative Bible Belt. That this approach of no sides, only love.
It's brilliant.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
And it works.
Yeah. So what are you able to say to the LDS Church now? If you were to write a new letter, are you able to, in your position, would you prefer not to say, or would you have suggestions or advice? Let's say Jeffrey and D. Todd and Quentin are sitting around a table going, "Man, we're getting our butts kicked. David, help us out."
It'd be pretty radical what I'd have to tell them to do, and they're not ready to do it, I'm sure. And that's it. Understand that the teachings, your core teachings, suggest that you embrace You embrace the LGBT community. You embrace the concept of committed relationships, of lifetime relationships, of commitment, of emotional intimacy and health, and emotional, of allowing people whose orientation, not choice, but how they
not lifestyle, not
but
sin.
whose actual orientation says that they're going to love somebody of their own gender, or they're trans, or there's any number of these issues, that they're God's children and they came this way and they're perfect. You either I mean, I tell the church leaders that you know this as well as I do. You don't want to admit it publicly, but you're either going to have to embrace this or you're going to become more and more irrelevant as more people come to understand this. And I've seen it happen. Never expected it to happen in this time frame. And they know this. And I know from experiences that I've had involved with Encircle with the brethren that they're scared. They're feeling like they are behind the 8 ball on this issue. It's at the tip of the spear.
They painted themselves into a corner.
Russell
M. Nelson, Dallin H. Oaks,
yeah,
painted themselves into a corner.
That's correct.
And there are other apostles who don't see it that way. So there's dissent even within the quorum of the 12, I've heard.
Could be, I don't know.
I know.
Okay, I'm sure you do.
Yeah, so keep going.
No, I mean, what I would tell them, if they want their organization to thrive, as opposed to diminish and become like the Elks Club at some point.
A very rich Elks Club.
A very rich Elks Club with some fanatical members, but not what the church was when I was growing up. They need to understand that they hold on to this doctrine of God would never do this. This is not allowed. This is evil. This is wrong. They need to let that go, and they need to practice what they preach, what they really preach at its core, and that is what Jesus Christ taught. Not that I believe now that Jesus Christ is the only prophet, but what Christ taught is what others taught, and they're true principles, and that is of love, and what love really means, and acceptance, and what happens when you are positive rather than negative, rather than sort of drawing on your Puritan past, draw on a little further back on what Christ really taught. And that's what I tell them. And, who knows if they will ever hear that message. They may have to at some point.
So you're having this radical message of look to your core doctrine.
Well, of course.
And inform your decisions based on your central message.
Or the decisions will be made for you. Because that's what historically plays out. Either it bends or it stops. And we've seen that again and again with major issues in the church.
Yeah. The problem is, I'm sure you know, is that if they say we were wrong on this, polygamy is strike 1, blacks in the priesthood strike 2, LGBT, it's like, you guys are just making this up. I mean, that's what people will conclude.
It's true.
You guys are just making this up. And then as soon as the prophetic mantle falls, it all unravels, like some say happened with Community of Christ, right?
Right. So, but you do the math.
So
Either they do that and that happens, the prophetic mantle falls, and it now no longer can be the one only true church and that's led by God and everything. Either that happens or they don't do it and they continue to become more and more irrelevant and looked upon as backwards and not loving, and they diminish as well on that end. So,
but it's slow decline, lots of money and power and influence. And from their point of view, a lot of people's lives are blessed because they continue living the Mormon way, which I think they genuinely believe is the best way. So slow decline, lots of money and power and influence on people versus a quick decline, steep drop in tithing, steep drop in membership, steep drop in reputation, power and influence. Who in the world would choose this?
Somebody who wanted to do the right thing, what Christ taught. That's what it comes down to. You either protect yourself from a business standpoint or you do the right thing. Not many people are willing to do the right thing at the risk of losing everything.
You did.
Well, I had no choice. I didn't. It was my son. I knew him. All right. But that's what it boils down to. You do the right thing or you don't.
So are you saying dare to do right?
Yeah, that's it.
Are you saying do what is right?
Do what is right, let the consequence follow.
What? Where did that come from? I'm just kidding.
Somewhere in the Chevy Chase ward for me.
I almost want to end on that statement. Any final thing you want to say?
No, just that this fills my heart to be here today and to find people like you and others, so many others that I found, not just in Utah, but all over the Mormon communities or ex-Mormon communities. I found that, I'm no longer alone. I have a tribe, I have a family, and that makes me feel wonderful.
How do our listeners support Encircle if they want to support? Not that Encircle needs more support, but they do need more support.
Sure, they always need more support because this is an organization that is going to grow because it's got an answer. And so they can either go on the Encircle website and donate. That's one way, however small, that's fine. There's also, you can volunteer. And you'd be amazed at the number of people that have just approached me asking, how can I volunteer for Encircle? Church members, ex-Mormons, non-members completely, that want to become involved. When you look at the number of people that have gone through the 4 hours of training to be a volunteer in Utah County, in Provo, it's staggering. I mean, over 700. Imagine that in Provo, in Utah County. And it'll be even more so up here. So that's a way to become involved, to go over to the house.
Get training,
to be involved in just being over at the house at certain times and being there as an influence to let these kids know that they're perfect the way they are and they are going to thrive. They have every ability to thrive, and that this is not a thing to be sad about. This is a thing to be happy about. Any parent that starts going through the journey that I went through needs to understand that it's true. You're headed somewhere where you never thought you were going to be headed, and it's actually better than what you ever imagined. And to understand that, everything changes. This is no longer a problem. This is no longer an issue. This is just a blessing. My son is a blessing in my life. I would not have it be otherwise. I would be less of a person. My life would be less than what it is. I love where I am. I love who I am. And a great part of that was accorded me by the fact that I had a gay son.
And for those for whom the church is no longer able to be what it once was and are wondering if there's life or joy or happiness after orthodoxy, what words of encouragement or wisdom do you have for them?
That it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be hard no matter how you go down that route. There will be at a start. But people need to understand that there is so much more as you go further down that route. For me, it was going from the point of the arrogance that I had of thinking that I had all the answers to everything to just getting to the point where I have all the questions, and that's fun, and that's good. And life becomes rich and more than what you thought it was. And just the point is, just like they tell LGBT kids, it gets better. Oh yeah, it gets better. And the biggest thing is just letting go of that thing that you think you can't let go of, that you think that defines you, that it's so hard and it's so scary. The fact is, it's like I said, getting pushed down another river that's dark, you don't know where it's going. You just need to know it's going to the place that it's supposed to go to, and it's rich and good down that river.
That sounds like faith.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
You can't have faith on more. I'm just kidding. You can't have faith. You have faith.
Yeah, you do. And it's funny that when you act on that, there's a consequence. And that's a good consequence usually.
Love it. All right. Beautiful. Amen. Amen, brother. All right. Thank you, David Eccles Hardy.
Thank you for this opportunity.
This has been a beautiful, epic, worthy. Your story is worthy for the Mormon Stories archive. And I say that with full heart. So thank you for the honor of having a chance to help you tell your story.
Thank you, John.
Yeah. And listeners, support Encircle, support worthy LGBT causes, and thank you for tuning in today. And support Mormon Stories and the Open Stories Foundation if you can. We, just like Encircle, we rely on the generosity of donors to keep going. So if you like this type of content, if you appreciate this sort of thing, if you want to see it continue, we would love your support. You can go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button at the top right. 10, 20, 50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. Donations, individual donations, whatever it is, it keeps us alive and it allows us to keep doing what we do. And we're thankful for those who support us. And we just make an explicit plea to those who want to help out and who feel called to help out. Maybe there are ways you can volunteer. Maybe there's a way you could sponsor an event. Just reach out to us. And just like Encircle, we also need support and need help and welcome it, because there are a lot of battles to fight. This LGBT is one of them, and there are lots of others, and we need your support. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Thanks again to David for his story. Please email us at mormonstories@gmail.com. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to comment on the blog, mormonstories.org. We'd love to have a robust conversation there. Email us if you have ideas of episodes you want to hear about. And if you want to bring a Mormon Stories event to your area, workshop or retreat, we're planning our 2019 calendar right now. These events are epic. Idaho Falls has 60 people signed up. We're going to road trip from Salt Lake to Idaho Falls, and we're going to karaoke in a 15-person passenger van to bring a Salt Lake contingency up to the Idaho Falls workshop. But again, we have Oregon coming up, Portland, Oregon, Sacramento, the Bahamas cruise, and Sweden and Switzerland for anyone who wants to go hang out with Hans Matson and the Swedes, or go to Switzerland to have a little workshop. But most importantly, if you want to plan an event for 2019, after our mixed faith couples retreat in January of 2019 with Julie D'Azevedo-Hanks, please reach out to us and we'll tell you what you need to do to bring one of our events to your area. But big thanks to Tim Corey for producing today's episode. He's a huge help, and to Cody Layton for his post-production work that he does. Huge shout out to Amy Grubbs and Sharon Price for their help in the Open Stories Foundation, along with all the Open Stories Board of Directors, which includes Craig Woodfield, Steve Holbrook, Nadine McCombs-Hanson, Kim Sandberg-Turner, and of course, Roger McComber, and our board secretary, Jeremy McDonald. So that's it for today. You guys stay tuned for more good stuff. We love you. See you again soon. Bye, everybody.